It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Katherine Wood. Dr. Wood studied biochemistry at the University of Oxford as her undergraduate degree. Afterwards, she moved to the University of Manchester for her doctoral studies in genetic medicine. After a successful completion of her doctoral studies, she returned to Oxford to work as a postdoctoral research associate in molecular medicine. Later, she made the decision to leave academia and took up a position as a development scientist in the sequencing chemistry development team at Oxford Nanopore Technologies. She is interested in translating our understanding of basic biochemical processes to the real world and supporting women in STEM subjects. Let's extend a warm welcome to Dr. Katherine Wood.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. So just what am I going to talk to you about today? So I'll go into a little bit more detail about my own journey and where I started and where I am now. I'll then look more closely at kind of the pros and the cons of working in academia and industry. Then different roles within a biotech company, or at least my experiences at Oxford Nanopore Technology. I'm sure you'll hear about other companies from some of the other speakers. Finally, I'll finish off with some practical advice from my own experiences of applying for jobs post-PhD. And then finally, I hope to leave plenty of time for any questions that you might have. So, my journey then. So, I started off with a degree in biochemistry at the University of Oxford. I had a particular interest in molecular biology and genetics. And during my last year, which was a integrated master's year, I was working in a lab looking at kind of RNA processing and the 3' end of pre-mRNAs. This led me on to do a PhD in the University of Manchester in genetic medicine. So this was a collaboration between the university itself and the Manchester Centre for Genomic Medicine. So working very closely with clinicians up in the hospital, as well as kind of basic research in the lab. Early 2021, I handed in my PhD and I moved back to Oxford, where I did 2.5 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine with the University of Oxford. And this was a position where, again, I was very clinical, so it was clinical genetics, looking at genetic diseases associated with older fatherhood. And then finally, just over a year ago, I left academia and I moved to Oxford Nanopore Technologies to take up a position as a development scientist. So, have any of you heard of Oxford Nanopore? Yeah. So for those who haven't, it's still a relatively small company. There's about 1,500 of us working there now, and we create DNA and RNA sequencing devices, from little handheld ones all the way to much bigger devices that are designed to enable sequencing of nucleic acids by anyone, anywhere, at a very reasonable price. And within my job as a sequencing chemistry, in the sequencing chemistry team, I am kind of on the edge between research and developing products, so still kind of that edge of research, and I do a lot of work on the kits and the sequences themselves to try and improve the technology that we have. So you might be wondering then, why did I go into a postdoc straight from my PhD? Why didn't I go straight into industry? And there were a couple of things that led me down that route. So firstly, I had a very successful PhD. I know that's quite rare, but I really enjoyed it. I had a great time. I had a really fun lab. I had lots of publications. And so the postdoctoral route seemed the really obvious route for me to go down. My supervisors were very much on the edge of you're a really good scientist, we want to keep you in academia. And obviously, principal investigators are those people where academia has worked out for them, they've been very successful. So they don't necessarily have experience of the industry route. So I felt quite pushed into the postdoctoral route. And also, I don't know what you were doing in early 2021, but we were still very much in COVID lockdowns in the UK. I needed a job, I needed money, and this opportunity came up. So I took the opportunity that was there. Ultimately, I don't regret doing my time as a postdoc. I got a lot of experience, I was more independent, I learned a lot of new techniques that I hadn't done in my PhD, and I think that really contributed to getting the job at Oxford Nanopore when I made the decision to move. But why did I make that decision? And I would say the number one reason is here. So 2 years ago, I started a family and my priorities really changed. I suddenly felt like I had a lot less flexibility for working, but I also had a need, obviously, for financial stability. I wanted to have time with my family and to have a good work-life balance. I don't know if any of you have heard of the two-body problem in academia. So if you're an academic, a lot of the time your contracts, so postdoctoral contracts, are very short. So 2 to 3 years is quite a long postdoc position. You're expected to move around, you're constantly applying for jobs. This can be even worse if you have a partner or a family where they're also in that situation. And even if they're not, it can be quite difficult. So my partner had a permanent position in Oxford in an industrial job. And so he didn't want to constantly be moving around and following me around. Add in the fact that we had a child and I wanted some sort of stability for our family. I didn't want to be worrying about moving around all the time. Suddenly that became my priority, to find something where I could have geographical stability, financial stability, and know where I was going to be in 2 or 3 years. And then you've probably also all heard of the publish or perish attitude of academia. And I think this diagram really sums it up very nicely. So in academia, you need to publish or you'll be out. But not only do you need to be publishing papers, ideally you need to be publishing them in high impact in journals, or you may well also have to leave academia. And you also need to be publishing frequently in high impact journals, and maybe, just maybe, then you'll be okay. And I found this a very stressful and difficult environment to work in. So often you'll find that the most difficult and interesting science takes a long time to do because it's difficult. So you won't necessarily be able to be publishing frequently and all the time. And I was constantly worried that my value as a researcher and how good I was at my job was simply being reflected by publishing papers all the time. And ultimately for me, I didn't think that that was an environment that I wanted to be working in long term. But there are lots of pros and cons of academia and industry. So I've talked to my colleagues who are still postdocs, as well as people within Nanopore about why they moved to Nanopore. So we can just go through some of those things in a bit more detail now. So something I really enjoyed about in academia is it's a chance to go really in depth into a research project. You're probably working on things that no one else is working on. You've got a lot of research independence, so you can follow your own curiosity. It's really exciting. Often you're really cutting edge, you're developing new techniques, and that can be a really interesting place to work. That means that you've got the opportunity to not only learn lots of new skills and techniques, but also develop new skills and techniques that nobody has done before. It can be very flexible, at least in the UK. So within academia, I didn't have, set hours that I had to work. I didn't have to be working at specific times. So I had a lot of independence and flexibility for managing how I wanted to do that. But I would say that is also a con, because while I could set my hours and what I wanted to work, it often meant that you worked very long hours. People might be expecting you to reply to emails at any time of the day or the night. If you're working on a project, for example, cell culture, and your cells need to be looked after at a weekend, that's on you to come in at the weekend. During my PhD, I think I had a period of 9 months solid of working 7 days a week because there was nobody else to help me on the project that I was doing. And that can be quite difficult. There's no overtime payments for working at weekends. So for me, getting that work-life balance I found very challenging, particularly as a postdoc. There's lots of opportunities to travel. So we're all here at this conference today. I went to lots of conferences. You get the chance to work in jobs in different labs and in different countries. So if you enjoy travelling and you don't want that geographical permanence, being able to do a couple of years in this country and then moving somewhere else, that can be a really exciting lifestyle, and you get to experience a lot of the world that you might not get to experience in other professions. It can be less political than industry. I don't know how that translates when you become much higher up in academia, but at least in my experiences it was probably less political. And if you like seeing your name in print and on paper, it's a great opportunity, because obviously you'll have publications, you'll have your name on it, and that can be really rewarding when those papers do come out. But there are a lot of problems with academia as well, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with these already, and some of them are like true to my story. So as I mentioned, the work-life balance can be quite challenging, particularly when you're working on short postdoc contracts of a couple of years, and it can often mean that real life feels on hold. So you might feel like you're behind some of your peers who aren't in academia. It can mean doing things that you might want to do, like buying a house somewhere, settling down your roots. That can be challenging, and you might feel quite left behind. I discussed the two-body problem and the publish or perish attitude already, but that also links into the fact that you're constantly going to be applying for funding and grants and fellowships, and often those applications will depend on those publications and what you've got out. And you might be spending 90% of your time at periods writing applications, for that then to be unsuccessful and you're back to the drawing board. And again, that lack of stability for me was quite difficult. There's definitely a lack of career progression and definitely limited opportunities in academia. So there's almost like a funnel system in academia. You've got lots of PhD students, some of whom go on to postdocs, and then if you're lucky, you might get a fellowship and start your own lab and become a principal investigator. But those number of positions are very small compared to the number of postdocs that you have. So you almost have this funnel where you have lots of people all aiming for the ultimate goal. And if you don't get a fellowship, if you don't become a principal investigator, you can become quite stuck being a postdoc with nowhere to go, and it's quite difficult to see how you could continue to build your career upwards. The salaries and the overall packages can also be less competitive, and that's something I really noticed when I was applying for jobs in industry, that the kind of packages I was being offered were considerably better than what I was getting as a postdoc. And finally, the impact of your research. So often in academia, what you're doing can feel quite far removed from the real world, and it's a very long process for translating research findings into the real world compared to industry. For example, I've been at Nanopore for just over a year, and already several of the things that I've worked on have gone out to customers. So you can see how the work that you're doing can be translated very quickly into something where you feel like you're making a difference. So then that takes us on to industry, and a lot of these are probably the direct opposite of what I've just talked about for academia. So I find that the work-life balance can be much better. This is probably different depending on what type of company you're at. So if you're at a small startup where you don't necessarily have a product on the market yet, that may be a lot more pressure, and the work-life balance may be less good. But at least from my experiences at Nanopore and maybe other larger companies, I have set hours that I need to work during the day. There is some flexibility, I can choose when I do those hours, so when I start and finish, as long as I do the right number of hours in the week. And on the rare occasions that I do need to do work out of hours, that's paid for with overtime, so it lessens that, it takes the edge off, and it does pay very well if you need to do overtime. That makes it a lot easier to manage family life, meaning as well that I have job security and stability, so my position is now a permanent position. I know that I've got that job for as long as I want it, provided that I continue to do well at my job. I would say that it's a more collaborative environment. So you might think that during your PhD you're collaborating with other groups, but I don't think I'd really experienced what it was like to collaborate until I moved to industry, where constantly within Nanopore we're working with different teams in our department and other departments, all helping each other out because we've all got exactly the same aim of improving the products that we're working on. So I do spend more time in meetings. That might be seen as a con, but it also means that I get to talk to a lot of different people, kind of work with them on short projects, find out what they're doing, and that can be really exciting. As I mentioned, there's definitely a more translational feel to the research. It feels a lot more applied. And there are certainly better opportunities for career progression. So I've been at Nanopore for just over a year, but I'm already in the process of beginning to lead my own team within the company. There are lots of structural processes in place that you can see how you can progress upwards. There are also a lot of courses for career progression, so it's definitely seen as more of a priority to help people kind of get to where they want to be. As I mentioned, the salaries and packages are a lot more competitive. Success certainly isn't viewed in terms of publications, but rather how well you work individually and also as part of the team. And I also find that there are definite and much clearer objectives and projects which are defined by the company priorities. So I know what I need to be working on. I'm not necessarily told how I need to do that, but it's very clear what the company want me to be doing. That can also be seen as a con, and it certainly took a little bit of getting used to. So there is probably less research independence. You might be moved off projects at very short notice if the company priorities change. So you might feel that you've been working on something for a couple of months, and then that doesn't matter anymore, and the next day you have to move on to something else. And that took me quite a long time to get my head around, that you wouldn't necessarily see a project go all the way to completion. The fast pace definitely isn't for everyone. I would say that high stress and high pressure environments are certainly not exclusive to academia. It's maybe different, so we definitely have times of the year where we're a lot busier, so we're leading up to a big company conference at the moment, so it's been very full on, but once that's gone, things chill out a lot more. But it can be very stressful at times. It can definitely be a lot more political. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about that. And then depending on the role, and I'll come on to that slightly later, there may be less opportunities to travel and move around the world and go to conferences, although I'm standing here today, so obviously there are still opportunities to do that. So does that mean that if you make a career decision, say if you choose to go into industry, does that mean that that's it, you can't go back? And historically that might have been the case. I think in the past it was a lot more difficult to go back from industry to academia, but these days that's a lot more common. And I know quite a lot of people who've gone into industry for a while and then gone to do a PhD and maybe a postdoc and then back to industry and then back to academia, gone up to professor level and then moved back. So I think that these days it's definitely not a final decision. There's opportunities to work in both and then decide what you want to do. And I would definitely recommend, if you get any opportunity, to spend a bit of time during your PhD working for a company, maybe an internship or a placement, or trying to do something where you can just get a bit of work experience. I would definitely recommend trying to do that. So now this brings me on to different roles within a biotech company, and this is very nanopore specific. I'm sure other companies that you might hear from later have other roles that I've not discussed. But you might think, okay, so the only thing that I can do then is work in research and development or R&D. That's certainly not the case, and we'll go through them now. So research, at least within our company, is very much, on the bench, small-scale ideas. You're trying to work out what might make our products better. They don't actually need to work, but it's kind of understanding at the very molecular level how we could make things better. When they come onto us in development, this is when we then try and take those ideas from research and actually make them function, make them into a product that we could then send out to customers. So that's quite a lot of still kind of hard thinking. So there's a lot of basic science, but then there's also a lot of QC, so quality control, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, how do we need to tweak things to make them a possible product. But then we've got lots of other jobs as well. So if you're into bioinformatics and computing, we've got a very big software team, and this is becoming more and more important by the day. We've got people who work in QC and production, so when we've got products that are ready to go out, we need people to do lots of testing of those products and then to actually make those products. We've got the sales and commercial people who actually sell our products to customers. We've got the finance teams who manage the money. We've got product management and technical writing. So product management is when we're about to release a new product, they're very heavily involved in how that release goes. For example, we have beta access when we send the product to a few customers, and then early access, and then finally going to kind of full customer access where anybody can buy that. And technical writing is a really interesting job, and I would definitely recommend having a look at that if you enjoy writing, as it takes skills in science, so you need to understand the actual science and what's going on, and also how you then write it and how you communicate it to customers in a way that they'll be able to understand, whether that be through writing protocols or data sheets, the website. So it's a very interesting job. We've also got the IT people who keep all of our computers working in the company and make sure that we're all okay. We've got the logistics team who actually send things out. And then finally, we've got the field application scientists, or FASs. And this is where I mentioned opportunities to travel. So our FASs are trained scientists and very detailed knowledge of how our products work. And then they're sent out to different customers across the world to help them with installations or running our products or using our products. And in that job, there's still a lot of opportunities to travel and move and visit different places. So it really does depend on the type of job that you do as to like what your opportunities might be. And even when you join a company, that doesn't mean that you have to stick in one particular job. So lots of people that I know have joined Nanopore in R&D and then have decided actually what they want to do is move into product management and then maybe go to sales and then maybe they want to go into IT or FASs. So there are lots of opportunities for different routes for career progression. So you can go linearly upwards in one particular way. So you could go from a scientist to a senior scientist to a principal scientist, but you could also move sideways and go into a different field. You could do a circle and come back round to where you started, having tried lots of different places. And at least in Nanopore, we offer secondments to other teams, so you can test out whether you'd want to work in a different team before you make that decision about moving. So I say there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of moving within the company to make sure that you're happy in the job that you're actually doing. So then this finally brings me on to some of the practical tips which I learned from applying for jobs both when I did my postdoc and then also when I wanted to move to industry. First and foremost, think about what it is that you want. So not what your mum wants, not what your friend wants, but what is it that you actually want from your job in the end. This is your decision, this is your future, and don't take that decision lightly. Take your time to look at what job opportunities there are and what skill sets you think you have and where you might be best placed. You don't have to apply for every single job that you see under the sun. There's going to be loads of them. Be selective and make sure that you apply for jobs that you think are relevant and would be interesting to you, and that you then can spend a good amount of time writing your applications for. In terms of applications, your CV and your cover letter do matter. They matter a lot. Don't rush them, and also don't undersell yourself. So, you're all doing PhDs, you're all really good scientists. Make sure that you tell those people that you're applying to how good you are. Get other people to read your cover letters, and also don't send the same cover letter to lots of different companies. Make sure that it's personalised for the job that you're applying to. Don't be afraid to reach out to people working at a particular company or within a particular academic group. Find out what it's like working there, ask questions. LinkedIn is a really good resource for that, so you can contact people through LinkedIn, but also email addresses you might find on faculty websites for different universities. No one's going to mind getting an email from someone saying, I'm potentially interested, can you tell me more about it? If you don't succeed at first, absolutely don't give up. So each application is another chance to practice how to write cover letters, how to do interviews. I applied for quite a few jobs. Some of them rejected me without even getting to an interview stage. Some of them I got to the interview and then I didn't get the post. And then I got offers in the end from 2 different companies. But each of those times that I did an interview, whether it was unsuccessful or successful, it was another chance for me to practice and get better at doing them. You'll probably find that interviews for academia are quite different from for interviews in industry. It was certainly a different approach that I found. The types of questions that I was asked were different. My way of thinking was challenged. So just prepare yourself and don't be disheartened if you don't find something immediately. You will get there, just keep going. And then only accept an offer if you're given one if you're actually confident that it's the right fit for you. So I've been an interviewee, I've been an interviewer, and I have to say that interviews are definitely a 2-way process. So the company is finding out if they want to hire you, but also you're finding out more about whether it's a place that you want to work. So ask for a lab tour if you can, have a look around the facilities, again try and talk to people who are working there, find out what it's really like, and take the time to think before you say yes. So the reason in the end that I opted for Oxford Nanopore and not the other company that offered me a position was that the other company was a much newer startup company. They didn't yet have a product on the market. It was a very small company, I think there were about 25 people there. And while it was more clinical, which certainly to me was quite appealing, I was ultimately worried that I may not have a job in a few years' time if they didn't manage to get a product out or they didn't manage to secure more funding. And given for me that the main reason I wanted to leave academia was to have a more stable and secure future, that seemed a little bit of a risk too far. So ultimately that's why I chose a company that was more established, that had products out, that had good packages, and that from experience of talking to other people, I knew that it was the right place for me at this point in my career. That's not to say that I'm going to be here forever, but I love my job at the moment, I'm very happy there, and it's what I want, like what I needed and what I wanted when I left. So I've talked for far too long now, so if any of you have any questions, feel free, and I'll also be around all day if you want to talk more specifics about the company and Nanopore.